Hey everyone, this is Mike from vSwitch0.com. Today I'm going to take a look at a script written in PowerShell and PowerNSX to remove all universal logical switches, routers, all universal objects from an NSX manager. I've run into this issue quite a few times now where somebody may want to remove a secondary NSX manager or decommission it completely. And NSX makes it really easy to add additional managers in a cross vCenter configuration. So it's really easy to take a standalone, make it into a secondary, and have all of your universal objects synchronize over to that manager. But if you wanted to actually take a secondary and make it a standalone again so that you could properly remove it, that's where some manual cleanup is required. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that cleanup that needs to be done can't actually be done in the UI, which is where you might need to use REST API calls or PowerNSX or something like that. So I created this script in the hopes that it will save everyone a lot of time if they do need to go through this process. So I'm going to run through that today in my lab environment here. Now, before we begin, if you do want more information on the script or if you're looking for the script, just check out the links below. You'll find a link to my blog post where you can find that. And there's also a few other links there. There's a link to properly remove NSX and also troubleshooting scenario number 7, which I kind of go through the manual process, how to do this in a smaller environment here. So this is my lab environment. You can see that there's a primary and a secondary there right now. The primary manager is associated with a vCenter called VC, and the secondary with VC2. Now, I created a bunch of universal objects of varying types. You can see that we've got some universal logical switches that are here, universal test 1, 2, and 3. I've also got a universal DLR here. I've also created some universal firewall rules, grouping objects, including IP sets. So a little bit of everything just to run the script through its paces here. Now, normally the process that you would do to make a secondary manager primary, the first thing you would actually do is from the primary manager, under actions, you would remove the secondary. Now, when you do this, this part of the process always succeeds. In my situation, the manager is accessible, so I don't need to check off this option here. And if I remove it, what you'll notice is rather than becoming a standalone manager, it's now in this transitional role called transit. And what a transit manager is it's neither a primary nor a secondary, and it's not a standalone either. It's basically a temporary role that's used to preserve all of the universal objects that are on that manager in case it does need to become a primary again. But in this situation, we basically want it to become a standalone manager. So normally what you would do is just select the transit manager, and then again from the actions menu, there's an option to change the role to a standalone. So if I select this, you'll see right away that there is a warning saying that all of the universal objects that were preserved on this transit manager need to be deleted. And if I say yes here, you'll see that NSX will not automatically go and clean these up. They need to be manually cleaned up. And you can see from the error message above, all of the varying types of universal objects are actually listed here. So you can see there's IP sets, security groups, security tags, etc. There's a big long list of varying types that exist. So if you had a really small environment, you might be able to clean this up from the UI, depending on the types of objects that are there. Like say, for example, if you just had a couple of logical switches, maybe a UDLR, you could go in and actually get rid of those. And I'll show you right now how you would do that. So from like the logical switches view, for example, here, if you select the transit manager from the dropdown, you can see that the universal logical switches still exist here. But if I select one, you'll see something a little interesting. The option to delete is actually not grayed out. You can actually remove them from here. If this was a secondary manager, remove would be grayed out along with the edit button, the pencil icon here. If you do need to change these, you have to do it from the primary, of course, but you can actually remove universal objects from a transit manager. Now, the problem is, you can do some of this from the UI, but there are certain object types that you just can't do from the UI. Like for example, under logical network preparation, you can't actually remove the VNI range. So the VNI range can be configured on the actual primary, this universal segment ID pool, but you can't actually remove that from a secondary using the UI. So that's where you'd have to use a REST API call or PowerNSX or something like that. So anyway, let's run through this process here. Before we begin, I'll just show you the script. So this is it here, and again, there's a link below to the blog post where you can actually download this. I'm not going to go too much into PowerShell or PowerNSX and the syntax and that sort of thing. There's lots of great resources out there, or maybe a video for another day perhaps, but just to give you a quick overview of how the script actually works. So it's kind of broken out into a few different sections here. The first section here just displays a warning message telling you that you should back up your primary and transit manager before you proceed. And it also asks you if you wish to proceed with the Y or N prompt. And if you answer yes, it proceeds. The second piece here is actually a bit of a safety precaution. This script will actually check to make sure that your manager is in the transit role before it proceeds. And the reason we do that is because you could potentially run this script against a primary manager by accident. And if you were to do that, and let's say, for example, you had several secondaries and you didn't actually want to get rid of all of them, this would delete all of the universal objects from the primary, and that would actually synchronize to all of your secondaries. So that could be a potentially unwanted and dangerous thing to do. So I figured it's best to just check to make sure it's transit before proceeding. The next section here is just a measurement of all of the universal objects that are there. So you can see there's variables for all of the universal object types, and then we use get commandlets to just get a list of all of those and get a measurement count. And you can see that we do use like varying options to select universal objects only. Sometimes there's a property that comes back is universal, is true or false. Sometimes there's objects that are managed by universal root 0, right? So there's a few different ways you can do that, but this will provide a count of universal objects only in the environment. And then this section down here just displays it, so it actually writes out the counts that we got previously. And then you were presented with another prompt whether or not we want to proceed to remove them. So this section down here is where all the removal happens. Each section is pretty similar, and it's quite simple the way it works. So we just basically get a list again, similar to we did to get the counts. And then we pipe that to a remove commandlet of the same type without confirmation. So this will essentially get a list of all universal logical routers, and for each one that's returned, it will remove it without confirmation. After that's done, we do another count just to see how many are there after the removal, and then we just do a little bit of subtraction to figure out how many objects were successfully removed. And we do this again for all of these various object types. Another thing to mention here too is that the order in which they're removed is very important, and the script does do it in the correct order. Like for example, we remove universal logical routers before we remove the logical switches. And the reason we do that is because you could potentially have universal logical routers attached to universal logical switches, and then you could have that error out. Same thing goes for firewalls too, right? Like we remove the firewall section and rules before we start removing service groups and IP sets and things that could be referenced in those rules. So that's very important, the order that all of this is done. And then once it's all finished and completed, we do another just reporting of the counts of all of the object types. So let's go and take a look at how this script actually runs. I already have PowerCLI and PowerNSX installed. I'm not going to get into how to set up and configure that, but there's lots of great resources online for that. Maybe a video for another day as well. So just to begin, we're going to need to connect to the correct NSX manager. And in this situation, we always connect to the transit when you want to remove those objects. Again, don't try to connect to your primary. The script actually won't run unless it's in the transit role anyway, but nonetheless, you'll want to run this against your transit manager. Before we begin, we're going to need to connect to it using PowerNSX. So I'm going to use the connect NSX server commandlet. And The recommended way to connect now is a bit different than before. In the past, you used to use the Connect VI server to connect to your vCenter server first, and then you would use the Connect NSX server to connect to your NSX Manager that's associated with that vCenter server. But I guess there was a bit of confusion, or the potential that you could connect to the wrong one and that sort of thing. So the way that it's recommended now with PowerNSX is to actually use the Vcenter parameter. So if I do -vcenter and actually specify the vCenter server that is the correct one. So VC2 was where my transit manager resided, so I'm just going to do that. And when it prompts for credentials, you'll want to use the correct SSO or vCenter credentials that have enterprise admin rights to that NSX manager. In my case, I'm just going to use the SSO administrator account. And that'll automatically create the VI connection and the NSX manager connection. So you can see here it's connected to VC2, and this is my transit manager there. And again, if you want to double check, you can always do get NSX manager, I think it's role, and you can see it is transit. Again, the script will report that as well. So let's go ahead and run the script now. And here is the warning message that I mentioned. Again, take a backup. It is a good bit of insurance. Since we are running this on the transit manager, if you do delete universal objects and you decide that was a mistake and you want to go back, all you really need to do is connect it to the primary again, and the universal synchronization service will send all those objects back over. But nonetheless, if something doesn't work as expected, that's really your only way of preserving the NSX manager database state and that sort of thing. So definitely worth the time to do. I'm just going to answer yes here to proceed. And you can see it confirms that it's in the transit role before it continues. And here's the count of all the objects. So you can see I've got a little bit of everything. I've got one universal transport zone, one segment ID range, and so on. You'll notice that there's a large number of service groups and services. And the reason for that is because NSX comes preloaded with a large number of read-only services and service groups. Now, I couldn't find a way to actually differentiate between a read-only service or service group and one that's user created. So what I do with the script is it parses through all of them. It'll fail to delete the read-only ones, and it'll just skip over them because I have it set to silently ignore the errors that come from that. So don't worry if you see some of those there, but when you do run it, you'll see a list of how many were deleted and how many were left behind, so you can kind of figure out whether or not that worked. So I'll run this right now and I'll show you what I mean. And again, you can see the familiar teal kind of banner at the top with progress. And you can see it'll actually report how many objects were removed. And here's the example I was talking about for service groups. So you can see one object was successfully removed, and there were 41 that were not. And I did put a little note there that they're most likely read-only service groups, and you can ignore them. You can still set a secondary manager to standalone, or sorry, a transit manager to standalone if read-only services and service groups exist. It doesn't care about those, only the user-created ones. So once the script finishes, you can see the count is now 0 for everything except for those service groups and services, which is perfect. And that's exactly what we want to see. So now let's go back over here. And now that those objects are gone, I should be able to change this to a standalone role. So let's go to Actions, set as standalone. Answer yes, and there you go. It actually worked. So one thing I did want to mention about this, there was one universal object type that I missed, and I'm going to be updating this script soon, but I just wanted to call it out here in case you run into a problem. Under logical network preparation, I did account for segment ID pools, universal segment ID pools, but if you did configure this for hybrid mode or multicast mode, you probably had to put in a universal multicast range of addresses. So if you did, that's the only universal object type that's not accounted for in the script, and you can remove that using REST API call pretty easily. Again, I'll try to provide a blog post or something on how to do that, as well as update the script to include that. But anyway, that's it. Hopefully that was helpful to everyone out there. And again, this was my first video that I've created for vSwitch 0. Hopefully there'll be a whole lot more. If you like it, please subscribe and keep an eye out for more. Thanks very much.